interaction. I should start out, make sure I thank my colleagues. I would like to highlight Christine Logel. The first 3 studies I'm going to talk about were from her dissertation. The rest of the team has worked together on the 4th study that I'm going to talk about, which is an intervention, a large-scale intervention that we've done to. So really the first 3 are going to be about how it develops, and then the last intervention hopefully convince you that it can be overcome, the chilly climate for women in STEM. Okay, I want to talk about a model of stereotype threat which has been around for a long time. And the basic idea is that we've argued that there are stereotypes that exist in the culture, something we called cultural stereotypes. And those cultural stereotypes give way to stereotype threat. And stereotype threat can lead to performance deficits, and it can lead to avoidance of stereotype domains, a real fairly simple model. And almost all the research on stereotype threat has been on this end of things. And this model actually comes out of, I don't know whether, I can't remember whether it appeared in the paper that Claude Steele wrote in 1997 on stereotype threat or not, but it certainly was one that we were using in talks from that long ago. So it's been around for a long time, that cultural stereotypes could lead to stereotype threat. Now we've said that without ever saying much beyond that. I mean, Claude in that paper argued there was a threat in the air. And I think that captures the feeling very well of the phenomenology of stereotype threat and what it's like. But I hope to today put some meat on the bones of that basic idea of how a cultural stereotype can lead to stereotype threat. And what is it that really is this threat that's in the air? And in the first 3 studies, what I want to be is very specific about what the behaviors are that can lead to stereotype threat, particularly when we're talking about women in math and engineering, and what are the behaviors that men that are higher in sexism can display that can lead to this sense of stereotype threat. And then when I talk about the intervention, I also want to talk about a new measure we've developed, which I want to argue, I guess, is a measure of really this cultural stereotype, this sense of the cultural stereotype, which ends up playing a particularly important role in how women do in the engineering program at the University of Waterloo. So for these first 3 studies I'm going to talk about, I'm going to translate that model simply how men's stereotypes lead to men's subtle, dominant, and sexist behaviors. And we'll talk about a little, and that's the model that I want to suggest. And then it's those behaviors that create performance deficits among women, and I certainly believe they would affect avoidance of stereotype domains among women, but I'm not going to talk about that part, although I think that would happen as well. So to give you an overview of these studies, in study 1, we're going to look at are sexist interaction partners associated with decreases in women's engineering performances. So we're going to set up a little situation in the lab where we have men and women interact with one another. They're all engineering majors. And we're going to see whether women do, and after they've had this little interaction, how that, we're going to have them all take an engineering test. And see if interacting with men who are relatively high in sexism versus relatively low in sexism will affect women's engineering performance. Really, in a sense, it's a correlational study, a simple one. How do men's level of sexism, how is that correlated with women's actual performance? In study 2, we're going to look at how it is that the sexist men create that chilly climate. We're going to argue just a simple interaction can help set up that chilly climate. In study 2, we're going to break it apart and we're going to really look at what are the actual behaviors that the men are doing in that little interaction. And then in study 3, we're going to test it causally. So in study 3, we're going to set up actually enact those behaviors and see if those behaviors with a different set of women can actually lead to decreases in women's engineering performance. And that's the part that I want to say that we're going to make some progress on how a chilly climate can develop for women in STEMs. And in study 4, I'm going to talk about a large-scale intervention that we did, well, relatively large-scale intervention, and we're going to, that addresses the chilly climate that hopefully can improve women's performance and we hopefully can measure it as well. Okay, so let's start with study one. Are sexist interaction partners associated with decreases in women's engineering performance? So for this study, we brought in 32 male and female engineering students, and we had them come in mixed sex pairs, one man and one woman. So they came into the lab, and they thought that they were going to do a psychology experiment, and they thought it was a psychology experiment that was going to have them complete a bunch of different measures and then have them discuss some engineering problems and then take a test. So it was pretty straightforward to what we were going to have them do. Now the first thing we had them do is complete a measure of subtle sexism. We actually wanted a measure of sexism without them knowing it was a measure of sexism, which isn't really all that easy. And we borrowed a measure that Bill von Hippel and Denise Sekakoptua had developed, and it's fairly straightforward in the way that we used it. There's just a bunch of sentences, and they think what they're supposed to do is complete the sentences. So this is actually one of them. Jenny went home to cook dinner. And there's 20 of these sentences, and we focused on just a few of them that could be viewed as being more sexist or not. And they just fill in the end of the sentence, and they can complete it any way that they want to complete it. That could be completed in a relatively sexist way or a highly sexist way. As one male participant said, Jenny went home to cook dinner naked. And we would say that's a relatively sexist way to complete the sentence. It could be completed in ways that would be less sexist. Jenny went home to cook dinner after work. That would be less sexist. And actually, that would be one that would be scored fairly low on sexist. Find that Jenny gets something other than just cook dinner. It could be. It could be even less sexist, where we actually rated it on 1 to 5. Jenny went home to cook dinner because her husband was too tired from taking care of the kids. So we had a range, and we had coders code the sentences, the 5 sentences that could be completed in a more sexist way, and we got generally good agreement on the level of sexism in these particular sentences. So we just looked at how they completed those particular sentences. We spent a great deal of time, and if you want to go look at the paper, you can, validating this as a measure of sexism, comparing it to other measures of sexism and so forth. And for our purposes, we wanted to measure their level of sexism without them knowing it. But we wanted it to be a relatively face valid way of looking at sexism as well. So this is the method that we chose, and that we used throughout this study, these set of studies when we look at this subtle measure of sexism. Okay. After they completed this measure, which we threw in a couple of other scales, so they wouldn't know what was talking about, we had them have a discussion with their interaction partner. And what we had them actually discuss is a New York Times article on the Hewlett-Packard Compaq merger. And this was a while ago when we were doing the studies. I don't know if you remember this particular merger. It was kind of contentious at the time. Carly Fiorina was the CEO of HP at that time, and she was pro the merger. She wanted the merger to happen. Hewlett, who's the son of the founder, I forget his first name, who was the chairman of the board, didn't want it to happen. And so the New York Times article had quotes from both of them presenting it. And they were supposed to discuss whether this was going to be a good idea or a bad idea with their interaction partner. And we had a scripted set of questions that they had to go through and discuss and decide whether this was a good merger or not. Now, of course, we picked this article because, well, the CEO of a major computer company, which certainly had something to do with engineering, had an opinion about this merger that was different from the chairman of the board, who, you know, comes from the founder of the company and so forth. And it was one where gender could come up. To be completely honest, we thought that as these discussions would happen, that actually gender might come up, and that people may say something like, oh, she's a woman, what does she know? We thought that perhaps the men would say that. Actually, audio taped all these interactions. Nobody said anything overtly sexist that we could say. They actually didn't say anything about her being a female CEO. None of that was said. But they did talk for about 10 minutes about this through this series of questions, and we just let them discuss the interaction. Okay, after that interaction, we had them all take a portion of the fundamentals of engineering exam. And the fundamentals of engineering exam is a very hard engineering test. It's the one that's required for licensure as a licensed engineer after people have completed their undergraduate degree. These were all students in their second year in engineering. We have a really good engineering program at the University of Waterloo. It's noted in Canada as clearly being the best. Nobody would contend with that at all, and it's a strenuous program. But this is a hard exam for these people at this point in time. They haven't had all the coursework that they need for it. There's questions on all the different aspects of engineering, and so it's quite difficult and quite challenging. And so they're all taking a test that's really hard after they've had this interaction. So that's the basic setup for the experiment. And the basic question was, if women are interacting with a man who completed this in more sexist ways, is that going to affect, and then they interact with him and talk about this merger, is that going to affect their actual performance on the exam? So if we look at the actual results, and this is the sexism of the women's partner, of the men in the study, and that they're interacting. And the data I'm going to present to you are set at 1 standard deviation above and 1 standard deviation below the mean on sexism. And so low is relatively low, 1 standard deviation below the mean, 1 standard deviation above the mean. And we'll look at both men's and women's performance. So what you find here is if we look at when women interact with men who are low in sexism, there's basically no difference. It's a very small difference that is not at all reliable between men's and women's performance when the men are relatively low in sexism. But when they're relatively high in sexism, women are performing considerably lower than the men and considerably lower than the women who interacted with a less sexist partner. Men who are high and low in sexism don't have any difference in their performance. They perform the same. High sexist men don't do better or worse than low sexist men in terms of their engineering performance. The numbers are virtually identical there. So when we look at this, it seems that women who were randomly assigned to interact with these men, we randomly paired people together, it seems that the women who are interacting with the men who are relatively high in sexism are underperforming on the test. They're not doing as well as we would have expected, a typical stereotype threat effect. Yeah?
I don't know whether you take questions, were they in the same room as their partner, and was that the only person in the room, and was the score known at the end?
The score is not known at the end, we actually they were alone in the room when they're taking the test, so we separated them to give them the test after they were in it. And yeah, please feel free to ask any questions you want as we go along. That would be perfectly, certainly any questions. Once to clarification of what actually happened right away, but I'd be glad to have any questions that you have. So we see this as a typical stereotype threat effect. And the question is, okay, now what's going on here? Why is it that women are underperforming when they're interacting with men who are relatively high in sexism? Yes?
Did you get any variance in sexism for the women, and did that make any difference?
There was a little bit of variation in sexism in women. That's a really good question. And it had women as they varied in sexism. There was more variation in men's sexism than women's, but there's quite a bit in women's as well. It has no effect on women's performance, high versus low in sexism themselves as they completed the sentence. Doesn't have any impact. It has no impact on men's. performance either, whether women are high or low in sexism doesn't affect men's performance either. So yeah, we did do those analyses. So what is it about interacting with these men who are relatively high in sexism that's undermining performance? So we could have gone about answering that question in a bunch of different ways, but we decided when we did the study to break it apart, this interaction, this naturalistic interaction where we see this stereotype threat effect, by first looking at the men and seeing what they're doing in the interaction. So in this study, we had 28 male engineering students. And the procedure was the same as study 1, except participants interacted with a female Confederate who was scripted to act exactly the same way in all those situations. So we also, as they interacted with this female Confederate, we also carefully video recorded the interaction and collected several subtle measures of sexist behavior. So the question, we decided, what is it that the men are doing in this situation who are relatively high or low in sexism? So again, they fill the subtle sexism measure like in study 1 before they start. And everything proceeds from an external point of view exactly like in study 1, except they're all interacting with exactly the same woman who's a Confederate, who's trained to act exactly the same way. And we videotaped it to see what was going on. But we had several subtle measures of sexism. And these were thinking about what happened in the first study and trying to do it. The first thing we noticed is how close the participant sat to the Confederate. We had it set up so that there were 2 couches in an L shape, one here and one here. And the woman was sitting on the one couch and we had a box on the other end. So the man had to sit on the other couch, but he had a whole couch where he could vary on how close he sat to her. He could either sit right on the corner, right next to her, or he could sit on the other corner, way away from her. So how close did he sit? And this was relatively easy on the videotape. We just, measured it, where it was exactly he sat. We also looked at the participant's body posture. And in particular, we looked at how open or closed the body posture was. So was he sitting with his legs spread apart and relatively open in a more powerful position, or was he sitting with his arms crossed kind of in a more timid position? So we looked at the participant's body posture, which was one of the things that we could do with the videotape as well. We also had the Confederate's report of how much he looked at her body, which was one of the things that we had her pay attention to as she was doing this interaction, and she reported how much he was looking at her body. It's important to know that the Confederate had no idea about the sexism level of the participant. Of course, nobody did yet because they just filled out the sentences and we coded them, much, much later. But she was also blind to the actual hypothesis of the study, that his level of sexism would affect it. So we tried to keep her as blind to that as possible. And to be completely honest here, we also wanted to pick this up on the videotape as well. But the trouble we had is about 3/4 of the guys wore baseball caps. and you just could not see their eyes on the videotape and what they were looking at. And so the Confederates report are really what we had to deal with. So a lot of them were wearing baseball caps, and so it was impossible to tell that from the videotape, but we did get her ratings of it. And then we had observers rate just 2 simple global ratings as well. And those ratings were how dominant the man was in the interaction, how dominant the participant was, and how sexually motivated he was. And so they made 2 global ratings on a 5-point scale. We had 2 raters, and they generally agreed quite well and on what those ratings were. Now, all 5 of these things, interestingly, in this setting, actually correlated quite highly and formed a really nice index. So they formed a nice, reliable index. So I'm going to show you just the results collapsed across all 5. The results are significant or marginally significant for each of the 5. And they form a nice, reliable index together. So what you're seeing here is men who what we originally called this the flirting study because of focusing on the sexual interest. But it turns out that the dominance is at least as strong and probably the stronger finding. So men who are more dominant in the interaction and also showing sexual interest in various sorts of ways. Now notice that in this study, as we videotaped it, nobody said anything that you could think of as overtly sexist. Nobody said anything about the part of their interaction with about the Confederate who they thought they were interacting with. Nobody said anything overtly sexist about the female CEO. All of this behavior is behavior that is relatively subtle. Although it's how close they sat to the participant, none of them actually touched the Confederate at all, so there's no actual physical touching. It's conveyed in body posture, it's conveyed in looks that can't be picked up on the videotape, that can't be picked up by the Confederate, so relatively subtle, but behaviors that observers can also pick up. Okay, so hopefully created enough of a pause so it's not to show you the results and present a little bit of attention. Okay, so this is the index of these subtle sexist behaviors, and we standardized all of them. So this is on a standard deviation scale over here. We have men who are low in sexism and men who are high in sexism. And what we find is that men who are low in sexism display less of these subtle sexist behaviors than men who are high in sexism. And so it seems that what men are doing here is they're displaying this behavior that's relatively dominant, shows sexual interest, how close they're sitting, more open body posture when they're interacting with the women. And that seems to be the behaviors that we're picking up that men are doing. But the question still remains, okay, yeah, the men are doing this, but is that what's causing the women to underperform? Now we have some interesting design questions here as we're trying to do a study. Now a lot of people nowadays would say with a study like this, okay, well let's measure these subtle sexist behaviors and see if we do a statistical mediational analysis, see if that will account for women's decrease in performance. But being the experimentalists that we are, we actually thought, I don't trust that statistical mediational analysis as much as let's see if we can turn this around. And in study 3, let's have women as the subjects, and let's train a male Confederate. And we actually hired an actor from the drama department to be the male Confederate in this particular study. And we went through the behaviors that we had, and we had people on videotape of these sexist men, and we said, what we want is you to enact behaviors like this high sexist man, or like this low sexist man, and we trained the Confederate to act as like the high sexist men in terms of exactly those 5 features, and see whether that would actually undermine women's performance. So we had a relatively small number in this particular study, 17 female engineering majors. We've replicated it for 3 other times though as well in the paper. And now the procedure is the same as study 1. It's that the women interacted with the male Confederate. And so now the Confederate is the male in the interaction. And he is trained to interact either like the men high or low in the subtle sexist behaviors. It's explaining all those things. And again, we measured performance on the fundamental engineering exam, as well as women's feelings about the interactions and their perceptions of the male Confederate. So one of the things we were really interested in this study, which we're trying to get at in this last part, is are women able to recognize the difference between, well, it's actually the same Confederate, but when he's acting like the high sexist men or the low sexist men, are they able to actually pick that up? So we had a bunch of questions about what are their feelings about the interaction, what do they feel about the Confederate, and do they see him as sexist as they're reporting this particular, as they report on this interaction with him. So let's first look at actual performance or score on the test. And what you find is when we look at score on the test, very similar to the results that we saw in the first study, now when we can think about it as causal, when they interact with the Confederate who's relatively low in sexism, they're doing quite a bit better. When they're interacting with the Confederate high in sexism, they're doing quite a bit worse. The performance is noticeably worse. And the effect size is actually quite large here, as it is on a lot of stereotype threat studies. We have just 17 subjects in this study and a significant effect. Yeah, Ben.
Steve, did you ever do that mediational analysis that you dismissed?
In this particular study?
No, back for the original data set.
That's a really good question. The answer is we audio taped in that first study rather than videotape. And yes, we do have a mediational analysis that works. But it is just simply in the length of time that the male talks the first time that he talks, which is much closer to the dominance. And it does actually work in study 1 if you do that. That's actually not in the paper because people, the editor didn't think that that was worth reporting and was all that trustworthy and so forth. But we thought of that as similar to the dominance. Now, we didn't have the sexual interest because we audio taped. But we did have an audio tape, and we could just look at the length of time. How much airspace did he take up before he let her talk? And that did mediate the effect in the first study. Now, this is score on the test. Now, I actually don't have any other slides to show you. I'm going to show you a bunch of effects. There are no effects on the women's, how they feel about the male Confederate. We asked them a bunch of questions about the only effect we found, in this study was just a trend. If we collapse across studies, we find it's actually significant in the opposite direction. Women actually liked the actor when he was higher in sexism than when he was lower in sexism. If you just ask how much they liked him, that's what you found. That's about the only effect there is to report. We asked them meta-perceptions of how sexist he was. They don't say he's more sexist. We asked them what the Confederate could report. How much was he looking at your body? Well, the Confederate, we had trained to think about this ahead of time and to pay attention. She noticed that the men high in sexism were looking at their body, and we had trained him to do some of that, but they didn't pick it up. They didn't say that he looked at their body more. So big no effect on all the explicit reports of what's going on in this particular study. Yes?
I'm just curious about your thoughts on the measure of sexism. So you're talking about women's performance on these tests, but you're talking about men looking at women in a sexual way.
Yes.
So what do you think is going on? So this is sort of activating the sexual sort of look of the man versus how they perform, which is not necessarily targeting the domain of performance.
Oh, it's not targeting the domain of performance. Now, one of the things, if you look at the paper, we were careful, one of the thoughts we had is that the issue might be body objectification. And we actually took a measure in 2 studies after this of body objectification, and women don't report any higher levels of body objectification when they interact with the actor high in sexism, when he's acting high in sexism. So that's a real interesting thought, something we thought about. In addition to that, we did a design, and actually body objectification would predict that women would underperform not only in STEM type fields, but in non-STEM fields too, because it would be distracting. So actually we gave half of them in another design an English test. And we get no underperformance in English, just in math. So we did math versus English, and we didn't get that. So it was one of the alternative explanations that we spent a good deal of time thinking about body objectification. And I mean that's a part of what I'm trying to answer and what you're saying here. But was there more to it though?
I just want to know what do you think is going on. So what is it? Like, what's the process? What's
happening
in his mind?
If I could say it in one word, it's respect. I think that the men who are high in sexism don't show respect for the women that they're interacting with. They see them either as somebody who's beneath them, or somebody who, or see them as somebody as a sexual object. And it comes out in different ways. I think the men who are lower in sexism are conveying an attitude of respect and interest and openness to what the women have to bring to the interaction. And so, that's what I think is the heart of the issue.
In making this case that they're oblivious, the women.
I don't know if they're oblivious.
I think I'm using a more extreme word there, but you're resting it on some null findings with some small n's. And I'm wondering, is that something you feel confident of, or?
Well, I wouldn't even say that. What I feel confident is, I wouldn't even say that there isn't some knowledge of what's going on and that the men are high in sexism. I don't know the lack of stuff. I'm relatively confident that even with a large N, we're unlikely to get strong effects on self-report measures. Because I think it very well may be that women don't want to acknowledge in this situation that they're interacting with somebody. He's not doing anything overtly wrong. He's not touching them. He's just, maybe he's acting. And this is, if you ask them, what you might find is he's cocky. Would almost be, which is an interesting phrase. That might be how they describe it. It's not as if they could, it's not as if they're it's not as if they don't know that something's going on. But I think they're very reluctant to create an accusation as well. And so I think you're not going to see it in the self-report measures. That doesn't mean that there isn't some awareness of what's going on. Yes.
And you didn't ask for any more neutral terms like stress, or even measure stress levels, or code stress levels of the video you have?
Well, pulling stress off the video, I don't think we could do. There was very little of that. So maybe we could go back. We still have the videos, and we could try and do that. It's an interesting idea. We did ask a whole bunch of different emotions, and there would have been things that would have been close to stress where we didn't find anything. So, but it's an interesting idea. Yeah. Phil.
So I'm trying to reconcile these findings with Terry Vecchio's findings on subtle forms of sexism and paternalism, where she finds that women are very sort of, they're very sensitive to very subtle behaviors. They pick up on objectifying gazes and behaviors. And I'm wondering if some part of what you've coded or what you've instructed your confederates to pay attention to and to demonstrate are in fact some kind of gender stereotype salience manipulation. Where if you think about dominant behaviors, long-windedness, objectifying gazes, those are things that also sort of, they make more salient the male-female stereotypes, particularly the ones that are relevant to STEM fields. And I'm not going so far as to suggest that there would be a mediational pathway you should test on that. But given your strong intuition that this is really about subtle forms of disrespect, is that consistent with or divergent from the idea that there would be a salience manipulation here? Because that's also kind of classic stereotype threat stuff.
Yes. Very good question, and actually Terry Vecchio was the external examiner on this dissertation thesis, and she asked some of the same ones. It's a really good question. I did tell you about another study with another set of data, which I think is somewhat consistent with that, but also could be argued in the opposite direction, and I'll tell you about the results and see what you think about how this relates. We also, in other work on stereotype threat, we've shown that women try to suppress the stereotype about their group, and that the stereotypes about their groups are actually less activated when women experience stereotype threat. They're less activated in this study with that same measure. So if you look at the stereotypes and you take a reaction time measure to the stereotypes, they're actually really slow in endorsing stereotypic words as words in this particular study. So, in some ways that's not classic salience, but it's classic stereotype threat type of effect. And I think it's consistent with what I was trying to say to David, in that I think that women in this situation they're motivated not to, at an explicit level, not to see themselves as being stereotyped. And this is part of the double bind of stereotype threat. Right. On one hand, you don't want to be stereotyped in this situation, and you don't want to see yourself as being stereotyped, especially when it's not overt, and you don't want to be making mountains out of molehills. if you're the women in the study. And so you're actually trying not to think about it in terms of stereotypic terms, and you're not wanting to call out this person as being sexist when there isn't anything obvious that's happening, but yet it still is having its toll on actual performance. So that's what I really think is going on. Yes?
One question about the first two studies. Did you counterbalance the order of when they filled out the sexism scale, or was it always at the beginning of the study?
It was always at the beginning of the study beforehand.
I'm wondering if you think that there's any possibility that that was doing something to kind of prime those men to be even more sexist, or kind of thinking about their sexist beliefs in the first part. I know it was subtle, but if you're writing things down, priming those beliefs that you maybe don't always think about or talk about, and I guess I'm just wondering, well, first of all, if you think that may have been part of it, if you would have had as strong of effects had you measured that after the interaction.
Well, after the interaction, it would have been hard to figure out whether the higher level
Or
of
maybe, like,
sexism was a
past
result
them,
of their behavior. But, you know, it might have been better to do it a couple weeks ahead of time. And that might, you know, and then brought them in, assuming some sort of stability in that, which there probably should be some stability. But that's why we went with the measure we did, is we didn't want to prime sexism in any overt way. And we don't think that the sentences that we did prime sexism in any overt way. But for the men who were sexist, they clearly were thinking about sexist things more, even though we didn't provide any prime. And so how do you want to think about that? Would they think about it? I actually think these men, if they can think, you know, these sentences, which are very, very similar, bring out sexism, that having a woman sit across from them is going to bring out sexism. So I actually think it wouldn't make any difference because we didn't do anything to actually prime sexism, and yet they brought, you could say it's chronically accessible. It's, I guess, the way that I would say it. So I wouldn't think it would make a difference, but it would be an interesting test to do it a little bit earlier.
Just a quick clarification on the sexism measure. So were all the statements about women?
Oh no, half the statements were about men. The ones we coded were all about women. For sexism. But no, there were 20 sentences. 10 were about men, 10 were about women, and they, many of them were things that, you know, didn't have anything to do with sexism, like Beth took the dog for a walk. I guess that could have been, but we didn't find even any sentences that, you know, but ones that were tied, really to say 5 of them were about traditional gender roles, where women were doing things that were traditional gender roles, and the other 5 were things that didn't have anything to do with traditional gender roles. Yes?
So I'm trying to connect your findings to some of the work in implicit bias and nonverbal leakage. So McConnell and Liebold showed that if you have high implicit biases against African Americans, then you have more awkward body language, which would be the closed and distant. But people like, you know, Laura Rudman showed that women are the one counter-exception attitudinally, right? That men prefer women. They have higher, more positive attitudes, right? That's the one exception where you have higher positive attitudes towards the outgroup. It's actually connected with the number of sex partners you've had and other kinds of odd things. So the normal story you tell for, like if I was thinking race, you would say if you have negative attitudes, implicit attitudes towards African Americans, you're going to have more awkward body language. The more awkward body language is going to be read, at least implicitly, by the African American, who might then trigger stereotype threat in a particular way, and lead to more awkward performance on a subsequent result. Here you find, so I'm just trying to figure out, but that's not obviously this story. And normally, again, from the implicit bias IAT literature, you find out that there's no obvious negative attitude than men who have higher implicit, right? So their biases run in the opposite direction. I'm just wondering if you could connect those literatures in any way.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. I actually think that the McConnell finding is going to hold primarily amongst people who are internally motivated at an explicit level not to be prejudiced. And I actually think that finding does not hold if you look at some of Trish Devine's work and Anthony Plant's work, when people have low internal motivation to control prejudice. And so I actually think there's a moderator in that finding, and I would guess that we have the findings we do because the men in this study are relatively low in internal motivation not to be sexist. That's probably that they're not worried about that. And so I would actually think there's a consistency. It's just with the motivation not to be racist is with the typical university sample is pretty high. The internal motivation is normally pretty high, and relatively few that are low in that motivation, where it's the reverse for sexism. Which is kind of interesting. Although it's positive, the views of it, they're maybe because it's positive, they don't feel as much pressure not to be prejudiced or not to be sexist as people feel not to be prejudiced.
And objectification and dominance might feel different, because it might be okay to be confident, as when you're told not to objectify, but they might overlap.
Yeah. Yes?
For study 3, what were the subtle sexist behaviors of the Confederate?
They really were the five that we talked about before, and we tried to. But some of them are obvious. We had him sit at a particular spot, 2 different spots on the couch. He came in second. We had him adopt an open body posture, and it really was versus. It's easier to enact it. We did have him, and we trained him to time it when he, after she sat down, he looked at her chest for 3 seconds. So we did kind of, we did have that, which is part of what he's saying. Now, the dominance came out, and we try to be really specific about that, is he always talked first when about it first, and he said, okay, our first question is, and we had a little script which he had him say for that first question, which actually cued what Ben was talking about when he asked about the mediation from the audio tape study, that he talked first and we had him go on a little longer versus he tried to let her talk first when he was in a low sexism condition. If not, then he said, all he just said was, what do you think about this first one? So that was the difference. Now the sexual interest, and it may have been part of the reason that they liked him more, is we did that primarily with smiling, and there were cues throughout the thing where we had him smile at her more. And we think that that's what people were picking up with when they were coding, as we talked to the coders about what they thought sexual interest was. And that's how we did those extra instances of looking at her and smiling. And so we try to be really specific in what we had to do. And it really was just those 5 things that we focused on. Otherwise, the script was exactly the same. Yeah.
Did you ever have the Confederate interact with males in the same way?
Really good question. We haven't done that. We started to do that study, and then we never really finished it. So it's really kind of an interesting one, whether this sort of interaction would undermine absolutely anybody's behavior. And it's one we should have answered. We ran like about 10 subjects, and then well, the paper was accepted, and we didn't. We were thinking we might have to do that one. We were running it as a backup study. As yet, after the 3rd time it had gone through review, we thought, oh, we better do that one, and well, we never finished it. But it's a good point. Certainly something we thought about. Okay. Any other questions before we go on to the second? Now, hopefully I've given you some idea of how the chilly climate can come about for women in STEM fields, and give you a sense that it's very subtle. Yeah.
I'm just curious, would you expect the effect to be the same if you switched the male and female roles in this exact study?
No, I wouldn't expect it to be the same, because men don't have this stereotype as something
So you think it's
that
a
they're worried
societal
about.
thing that the women come into the study with?
Yes, and hopefully I can make that case better in the second half. So hopefully I've given you some sense of how the chilly climate can come about, how it can happen with subtle behavior, how it can happen with behavior that I don't see any way that you could come up with rules to prevent this type of behavior. If you're running an engineering program, you can say things like you can't say demeaning things. But, I mean, you can't sit within, a foot. There's no way any of these behaviors are things that you could do explicit things about in terms of policies and so forth, and yet the chilly climate can develop just from these very typical types of behaviors that people have. So here's a summary. Men higher in sexism interact on an engineering task with greater dominance and sexual interest. These subtle sexist behaviors create stereotype threat, which undermines women's performance. Although women can recognize these subtle behaviors, they typically do not, as they're quite subtle, at least on their self-reports. Now, is that a motivation to not want to feel like they're experiencing sexist behavior or not? That's an interesting question. Instead, we think that the chilly climate often has its impact through women's implicit views of how they are viewed by others in their environment. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do in this next project is talk about a new measure that I think measures more this chilly climate, this cultural stereotype that I'm going to talk about, and try and use that as a way to capture the chilly climate and these feelings. So that'll at least give me some connection. So if we go back to this model of stereotype threat, we said that there's this cultural stereotype that causes stereotype threat, which creates performance deficits. And what I want to argue is that what that chilly climate can create is what I want to call implicit normative evaluations. That this sort of cultural stereotype can be experienced, if we use experience and not the conscious way, at an implicit level, in terms of normative evaluations. And what I mean by normative evaluations, and I think it's important when we talk about implicit measures to make a distinction really between attitudes and norms, which is classic in our field. We have implicit views that are our own, that we recognize, how we feel about something. But we also can have, I would argue, and some of my most recent work with Mark Zana and Jennifer Peach and some of my colleagues have looked at, we also have a sense of what most people feel about something, what people in general feel about something. And that we want to argue that that's an implicit norm, a sense of what people, how people evaluate and how people evaluate an object in general, or in this case, female engineers. How do people feel about female engineers in general? And that chilly climate can affect that sense of this implicit view of what most people think of female engineers. And it is that implicit normative evaluation that creates stereotype threat. In a sense, this is a marker of that cultural stereotype, this implicit normative evaluation. And that we're going to talk about measuring that and look at that as creating stereotype threat. At the same time, we want to undo the effects of this implicit normative evaluation so that stereotype threat doesn't happen in a real intervention setting. So that's what I want to talk about in study 4. This is an intervention to overcome this chilly climate. The participants were women and men in the first-year engineering program at the University of Waterloo. This actually unfolded over 4 years. We're talking about 150 basically participants over this 4-year period. We recruited them in different ways over the 4 years. The first year we recruited as they came in. After that, we went to classrooms and recruited in first week of classes. They were given one of 2 interventions or a control condition. I'm going to describe both of these in a second. A belonging intervention, which is similar to the work that Greg Walton and Jeff Cohen have done. A self-affirmation intervention, which Jeff Cohen has done, and Julio Garcia and a bunch of other people. And a control condition. And the control condition, what we actually gave them is a study skills course. Mike Ross has studied this at the University of Waterloo. It turns out the study skills course we knew ahead of time was totally ineffective in increasing people's grades. But we wanted them to have another experience where we could set up the same sort of thing, but it was presumably about helping people study better. And so that's the control condition. We measured people's implicit sense of a chilly climate, what I'm calling these implicit normative evaluations. 2 weeks after the intervention, we actually measured it also though at the beginning of the term. So we measured it at the beginning of the term before the intervention and 2 weeks after the intervention. before the end of the term, and then the primary dependent variable is the grades after the first semester. So after we got people to be a part of the program, we had them go on the internet, fill out a bunch of measures, including our implicit normative evaluation measure, had them come to the intervention. After the intervention, then we measured their implicit norms again, then got the grades from the registrar. Okay, let me tell you about these interventions. So let me start with the belonging reconstrual intervention. What they saw was a PowerPoint presentation that played when we had them come in. And they see an upper year student talking about doubting their belonging in an engineering program, but over time coming to feel that they fit in. And I'll give you an example of this. We called it the STEP program, and I can't remember exactly the acronym for it anymore. Engineering program, or a transition to engineering program, I forget what the S stands for. And so they would hear about Raymond, and this was, they didn't have belonging construal, and we'd show a picture here, and they'd actually hear an audio tape with the words, though, coming up at the same time. Of course, we didn't have belonging construal treatment on there. And he would say, when I first got to Waterloo, I worried that I was different from the other students. Sometime after my first year, I came to realize that almost everyone feels uncertain at first about whether they'll fit in, and so forth. It's something everyone goes through. And then he goes on to talk about how he joined a group on campus and came to feel like he fit in. And there's 10 of these students talking about it, and 6 of the 10 talk about feeling like they didn't feel like they belonged and eventually felt like they could belong. It punctures pluralistic ignorance that basically everybody feels that, oh no, do I really belong here or not? But we think it's particularly important for the women in engineering and the minorities as well, who are experiencing stereotype threat, and we thought that that would be effective. Now, we didn't just leave it at that. We also kind of ramped up the belonging intervention a little bit. We had people then write a letter to a student who was coming in next year that we said would be helpful. And in that letter, they had to write about how everyone has belonging concerns from time to time. But over time, they themselves had come to feel that they belong in engineering. And this is only in the middle of the first semester. So now we get them, this shows that actually started as an undergraduate as a dissonance researcher. Mark Zana is a part of this project, and Mark Zana has done dissonance forever. We thought, well, why not use dissonance to create a stronger sense that they belong here as well. So now we do essentially a dissonance treatment. And it's designed to reconstruct their experience. So they see their doubts about belonging and their negative experiences not as diagnostic of a lack of belonging. They see it as actually, they now should see their lack of belonging as something typical and something that they can deal with. The affirmation training was somewhat similar. We again had upper year students talk about learning to affirm personally important values at times of stress. So we had them, and again we had 6. They all used different values that they did to affirm themselves, and how they build those value affirming activities into their daily life. So this is what came up again. Of course, affirmation training treatment isn't there. If they were in this, they heard about Mahesh. He's a 3B environmental student, and by the way, it's the 3A and 4A and B is partly because students in the engineering program do 1 semester on campus, 1 year off as a co-op, then 1 back on campus. So it's 1A and 1B, but that can be moved all around in 3A and 3B. So they all know what that means. It probably doesn't make sense to you, but it does to them. And so Mahesh says, in the first year I was just so completely caught up with life at Waterloo. It was hard at first, and it was stressful. But then I realized that, well, there are times outside of engineering. There are things outside of engineering that I care about. And he said I decided to get involved with an environmental group here on campus. And when I did that, I felt that I could turn to that at times of stress and so forth. again, they wrote about how they wrote a letter to an incoming student and wrote about how in times of stress they have their own value that they draw upon in order to feel better about it, and wrote that in a letter. Oh, and by the way, we also gave them a keychain. As they did that, they wrote that value in the keychain and put it on their keys so that they could take around their affirmation with them, and as they were going about. And so we train them, basically, is what we're thinking, to affirm themselves when they feel stressful. And it's designed to teach them to self-affirm and builds on these other values, affirmation, manipulation, or interventions that have proved effective in alleviating stereotype threat. Okay, so those were the actual interventions. Both before the intervention and afterwards, we measured this measure of implicit normative evaluations. We did that using the IAT. Now, the IAT in its traditional form has labels that are unpleasant and unpleasant, or unpleasant and pleasant, and people see words that say vomit, for example, and they're supposed to press the unpleasant key. They see words like sunshine, they're supposed to press the pleasant key. Now, Russ Fazio has argued for some time that basically this traditional measure has a problem in that pleasant or unpleasant could be unpleasant to me, something that I like. And Russ always uses the example peanut butter. That would be something that would be pleasant to most people. And he would even say he'd probably press pleasant for peanut butter, but he's allergic to peanuts. So personally, that's very unpleasant. And he draws a distinction. And as Russ talked about it, it seemed to us that there is this distinction about what I think about things and whether they're pleasant or unpleasant, and what most people think about things and whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. And the traditional measure actually, in a sense, confounds these two measurement criteria, both what the norms are, what most people feel about it, and you could say sunshine is pleasant because I like sunshine, or sunshine is pleasant because most people like sunshine. So in this particular study, and in a bunch of research, in the traditional IET, it does things like apples and candy bars, and you're presented an apple or a candy bar, and then you're presented with something like this, where you do both keys at the same time. And if you're faster with pleasant or candy bar, then when candy bar is presented with unpleasant, that would indicate a positive implicit association with candy bars. Our basic argument was that with following Fazio's revision of it, where you substitute I like and I don't like in the traditional IET, that we could look at the association between what most people like, and in this case, it's female engineers. So Fazio and his colleagues modified the IET, and they showed that on traditional attitudes predicting of behaviors, the I like versus I don't like predicts better than the pleasant and unpleasant. And from our point of view, that's because the traditional is contaminated with, if you want to say that basically it's measuring both things at the same time, also this norm. So in our modification, we are measuring implicit normative evaluations. We substituted most people like for I like and in their measure. And so we think of this as a measure of implicit norms. What we would say happens in a typical engineering program is there's this chilly climate that develops. And that chilly climate actually creates more negative implicit normative evaluations, and that leads to lower grades. The more negative implicit the more negative implicit normative evaluation leads to lower grades. That's what we expect to happen in a control condition in our particular study. Now, we also have a predicted effect, though, of what's going to happen in our belonging intervention. So what we're going to argue is our belonging intervention breaks apart this chilly climate. So now that there's no relation between this chilly climate and the development of implicit normative evaluations. That means that the belonging intervention should lead to more implicit positive, or more implicit normative evaluations, which will lead to more positive grades. Now the affirmation we expect the affirmation will affect implicit norms in a different way. Affirmation in and of itself won't prevent the implicit normative evaluations from developing, because people are still going to feel like they don't belong, but it gives them a way to cope with it. So there's no relationship here between implicit normative evaluations and grades. So we actually expect a different model of how things actually unfold with the affirmation intervention than with the belonging intervention. So technically, if you want to say it statistically, the chilly climate still predicts implicit normative evaluation, but the relationship between that and grades is moderating. It should still predict in the control condition, but it won't predict in the affirmation condition. We'll see no relationship. Okay, so let's look at our overall outcomes. Let's start out with fall semester grades here. And if we look at their fall semester grades, and the grading scale is a little different in Canada, so I want to make it clear, this is their actual grades, A range, B range, C range, and failing. What we see here is both the belonging reconstrual and the affirmation training. Women are doing just as well as men. Now, there's a caveat here. There are 13 engineering majors at the University of Waterloo. This is the 7 engineering majors where women are strongly underrepresented, less than 20%. Of the students in those majors. There are 6 majors where women make up more than 25% of the students in the majors, and we don't see underperformance there. Where women make up a larger proportion of the students in those majors, we don't see underperformance. But in these where women are underrepresented, we see clear underperformance. But both the belonging, reconstrual, and the affirmation training reduce those, will actually eliminate the underperformance. And there's actually slightly higher performance for women and when we remove stereotype threat than men, although it's very tiny. So we get, the intervention works and improves women's grades in these areas where women are underrepresented. We also see an interesting effect when we look at the changes in our implicit normative evaluations. What we see here is, and these are changes from 0 over time, from the time 1 measure of implicit normative evaluation to time 2. Men actually develop more negative implicit normative evaluations of women. Women in the control condition develop more negative implicit evaluations of female engineers. Women in the affirmation training condition develop more negative implicit evaluations of female engineers. But the belonging reconstrual prevents that from happening. There's no difference here from 0. They have essentially the same implicit normative evaluations of female engineers at the end of the first term that they did at the beginning of the first term. So that development of the negative implicit norms doesn't develop in the same sort of way, which is exactly what we would have predicted. So if we look at the more mediational analysis, let's look at the belonging reconstrual. The belonging reconstrual versus the treatment, we see that it is associated with this implicit normative evaluations. That's essentially just the ANOVA that we saw before, done in a regression. Belonging reconstrual does lead to most people liking female engineers, and that does predict grades. And actually, if you do a full bootstrapping model and so forth, we get significant mediation. It's really quite strong that the belonging intervention is mediated through these through the statistical analysis through implicit normative evaluations. We get a very different pattern, though, when we look at the affirmation intervention. What we see is in the affirmation intervention, if we look at what is the effect of implicit norms on grades, in the affirmation condition, implicit norms are not at all related to grades. It doesn't matter how negative or positive the implicit norms are, you get exactly the same grades. But in both the control condition and in the belongingness condition, the more negative the implicit norms, the more negative the grades. So we get that moderated relationship that we predicted for the affirmation manipulation. So said another way, the belonging manipulation seems to prevent women from developing these implicit norms, and the affirmation intervention seems to work by giving women a way to cope with those negative norms so that they no longer predict negatively towards grades. If I want to finish up here, I would say that men's subtle sexist behavior can create a chilly climate that increases stereotypes and undermines women's performance. And women may not explicitly report such a chilly climate, but we can measure it with implicit measures. Such implicit measures of a chilly climate indicate that the climate gets cooler over the course of the first semester, if you want to use the metaphor more. These implicit measures provide a compelling account of women's decrease in performance in the actual engineering and the intervention can prevent such a chilly climate from developing or provide women's tools to cope with it, thus dramatically improving women's performance.